2015 report on Turkey. And let me give the floor to Mrs. Hennis-Plasschaert on behalf of the Council.
Sur la Turquie. So sorry, too many debates, one after the other, but I'm happy to be here. Madam President, Mr. Commissioner, honourable members, the EU-Turkey relationship is of strategic importance and we share a long-standing history of wide and deep cooperation. But just as we have many shared interests, we also face many common challenges. This has been particularly highlighted by the migration crisis, and President Tusk reported to you on this earlier today. As you know, accession negotiations are ongoing. We opened the latest chapter, 17, in December last year, and plan to open another chapter, 33, with Turkey in the months to come. And let me underline that in this context, we continue to work within the framework of our existing rules for the accession process by unanimity, sticking to the strict but fair conditionality and without creating any shortcuts. From the Commission's report, it is clear that Turkey has registered progress in many fields of the acquis, and that is good news. It is, however, equally clear that many current domestic developments and worrying events in Turkey give cause for serious concern. Turkey needs to urgently remedy and address major shortcomings, notably in the areas of rule of law and fundamental rights. The Council has called on Turkey to ensure full respect of human rights, in particular to take urgent steps towards reversing the undermining of the independence and the impartiality of the judiciary and the significant backsliding in the area of freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. These are indeed important and pressing issues, also duly highlighted in your resolution. As reiterated by the European Council in March, we expect Turkey to respect the highest standards. In our contacts with Turkey, we also take every opportunity to recall these concerns. Also, we have repeatedly called for a resumption of peace talks to end the violence in the southeast, so urging for a political solution to the Kurdish issue. Madam President, in closing, I would like to welcome the renewed engagement of the parties to the settlement of the Cyprus issue. And we continue to expect Turkey to actively support the negotiations. Like you, members of parliament, we hope that they will yield a fair, comprehensive and viable settlement. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Madame. Je vais passer la parole à Monsieur Hahn au nom de la Commission.
Mr. Hahn now for the European Commission.
Madam President, Minister, honourable members, let me begin by thanking the rapporteur on Turkey, Mrs. Kati PIRI, for the high quality of the report we are discussing today. It addresses the key issues of EU-Turkey relations and generally concurs with the Commission's findings in its 2015 enlargement package and the report on Turkey. In the current context of the migration and refugee crisis, the geopolitical situation in the region and many interests jointly shared by the EU and Turkey, it is crucial to further reinvigorate and strengthen our cooperation with this strategic partner. Naturally, our relations have recently focused on the migration challenge, but they do and should continue to encompass a much broader range of issues to enable us to tap the full potential of this relationship. The re-energised accession process remains the core of our relations. We share your hope that the opening of chapters will lead to concrete progress in Turkey. In line with the EU-Turkey agreement of the 18th of March, the Commission is currently working on a proposal to the Council to open accession negotiations on financial and budgetary provisions. We are also preparing for the opening of further chapters, including in crucial areas of the judiciary, fundamental rights, as well as justice, freedom and security. We are doing this without prejudice of the positions of Member States, and in accordance with the negotiating framework. In this context, the Commission is encouraged by the progress in the Cyprus settlement talks, and we look forward to the successful and swift conclusion. We count on Turkey's lasting and concrete contribution to such a comprehensive settlement. It would be very good news for Europe and for the security and stability of the region and in the region, and would also contribute to a major turning point for our accession negotiations with Turkey. Let me also thank you for your strong support for structured and more frequent high-level dialogues. The recent high-level political dialogue and high-level energy dialogue have proven to be successful formats to move forward our joint agenda with Turkey. A high-level economic dialogue on the 25th and 26th of April will increase EU-Turkey business contacts and will allow an open discussion on macroeconomic issues, economic policy and investment opportunities. As already discussed in the morning, our comprehensive cooperation agenda with Turkey on migration has started to produce first results towards achieving our goal of ending the irregular migration from Turkey to the EU and breaking the pattern of refugees and migrants risking their lives. The Commission shares the European Parliament's concern about the respect for the rule of law and fundamental freedoms in Turkey. These concerns have been exacerbated by recent worrying developments, including those targeting the freedom of speech of academics, trials of prominent journalists, or decisions affecting private assets in the media sector. We have repeatedly called on the Turkish government to re-engage in reforms in line with European standards and to actively consult all stakeholders. We believe that defining the opening benchmarks and working with Turkey towards the opening of the chapters 23 and 24 will significantly contribute to Turkey's renewed commitment and reform efforts in these fields. The European Union also continues to voice its concerns about the serious situation in the southeast of Turkey. A genuine political dialogue in the framework of the Kurdish settlement process is the only way to achieve a peaceful and sustainable solution. The Union remains ready to support such a progress. To conclude, the Commission is fully confident about the benefits of the increased cooperation with Turkey to address the migration crisis and to deepen our relations in many other areas. Thank you for your attention.
Merci. Nous allons entamer le tour des groupes avec Madame Piri.
And now speakers on behalf of political groups, starting with Ms. Piri, S&D.
The EU and Turkey are facing many of the same challenges. Think about the refugee crisis, the threat of terrorism, and a long-lasting conflict in Syria that creates instability. One thing that has been made clear through these challenges is that Turkey and the EU need each other to find solutions to combat these issues. However, and I want to stress this, we cannot turn a blind eye to the internal developments in the country. Turkey must be stable and more democratic if we want it to be a strategic partner we can build on. Linking the accession process to the migration cooperation is neither wise nor fair. Accelerating talks should depend on the pace of reforms, not on a political tit-for-tat. A lot has already been said this morning on the EU-Turkey deal. So just shortly, the Turkish population has been hosting 3 million refugees. Many European countries could learn from the hospitality shown in this regard by the Turks. But also Turkey is reaching its limits, and it's time that the EU really reaches out to help by providing large-scale resettlement of refugees to EU countries. That is genuine burden sharing. That is genuine cooperation. Over the last years, many chances to further connect and work together have been missed. Let our current talks on migration lead to a more intensified and honest dialogue. This means that genuine concerns should not be taken as insults. The situation in the southeast of the country is of great concern to this Parliament. The EU urges that peace process to be relaunched, as there is no military solution for the Kurdish question. The current status quo is unacceptable. While we deeply regret the return to violence by the PKK and strongly condemn the attacks against security forces and civilians, when it comes to the anti-terrorism measures by the government, however, we stress that this must be proportionate and in line with international law. 400,000 citizens that had to flee their houses because of the violence and the 24-hour curfews in many Kurdish populated cities put a very heavy toll on the livelihood of ordinary people. We believe that Turkey has to return to a path where journalists are not imprisoned for doing their jobs and also censor does not become an instinct for journalists. Also, Turkey has to return to a path where academics are not losing their jobs and put in jail for expressing their views. And finally, Turkey has to return to a path where judges do not hesitate to decide and to rule a verdict out of fear of being displaced or fired. We need a more stable and democratic Turkey. This is not a threat, but an encouragement. It's important that Turkey returns to the path of democratic reforms and grasps this opportunity of closer engagement with the EU. And finally, Chair, let me thank also my colleague, co-rapporteurs for the good cooperation and that we can send a strong signal from this Parliament with this resolution. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Piri. Acceptez-vous?
Ms. Piri, there's a blue card for you. Mr. Christoforou would like to ask you a question. You accept?
Monsieur Christoforou.
Thank you, Chair. I would like the rapporteur to tell me very clearly if she feels that it is the European Union's fault that the accession negotiations are not progressing, because Turkey does not want to implement for many years, not just now that we have the refugee crisis, the necessary conditions. They want to be given favors, to be given a favor and to be accepted to the European Union with different conditions, because all other countries and all candidate countries have fulfilled these conditions. And something else, can the rapporteur really say that even today we should open more chapters if Turkey does not fulfill the conditions?
Madame Piri.
Thank you for the question, dear colleague. It's clear that it would be too harsh to say that it's up to the EU that the process is not accelerating. First of all, the responsibility lies clearly with the Turkish government. And of course it is a merit-based process. But we must judge Turkey the same way as we judge also other candidate countries. And there I have to say there has been certainly political differences being played, that some political parties, some politicians in Europe have not always treated Turkey fairly based on the reforms in the country.
Thank you. Ms. Sommer has 2 minutes for the EPP.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to thank Kati PIRI most sincerely for her collaboration. Likewise to the rapporteurs from the other groups. They reached an agreement and they've largely stuck to the resolution last year. They took their cue from that and they were successful and they've made it simpler. So I don't understand what's going on, Kati. You only want to keep the part of the agreement, it seems. Look, you can't just take over somebody else's voting list, and the EPP won't be subject to pressure from another group or from a wave of refugees. Our task is to grapple with this resolution and to gauge the internal security of Turkey with a view to its possible accession. Let's not confuse this with the refugee crisis, even though it's very serious. We should stress the fact that there can be no ground given to Turkey. That applies to visa liberalisation. All preconditions for that must still be fulfilled by Turkey, and opening up negotiating chapters must continue to be linked to the fulfilment of the appropriate preconditions by Turkey. Turkey has failed to do this. Freedom of assembly, freedom of the press have been stamped upon. The state is intervening in the justice system. There's an escalation of violence in the south east. Those are all retrograde steps. If we want to be good neighbours with them, if we want to continue our sound and neighbourly collaboration, and if we want to expand upon this, then we have to keep talking to one another and negotiating. This will only work if Turkey gets back on the European path. There are certain chapters to do with the Republic of Cyprus. Well, that's a sine qua non condition. Turkey needs to play a role here. It needs to at last acknowledge the Republic of Cyprus, and working on the basis of European values and principles, Turkey needs to work towards a reunified state there. That's in the interest of Turkey itself.
And now Mr. Demismarker for the ECR has 1 minute.
Thank you, colleague Piri, for the report. From reading the report, we see that the authoritarian behaviour of Erdogan is detrimental for Turkey and also for the EU. I have been expressing for some time in this Parliament my unease and disgust about the way journalists are treated and the situation regarding freedom of expression, but things are getting worse. In the most recent index from Reporters Without Borders, Turkey is on the 148th position out of 180 positions. The peace process with the Kurds is degenerating into state terror. And you said that you are concerned, and you said that the peace negotiations need to be resumed. But you've been asking for this, but what's happening? But the southeast of Turkey is a war zone, and then there's the ambiguous role of Turkey in the fight against IS. Insufficient efforts have been made to provide foreign fighters money or equipment reaching Syria. And
Merci, Monsieur Lambsdorff. 2 minutes.
Thank you. 2 minutes for Mr. Lambsdorff, the LDE. Thank you very much, Madam President. As we've heard, there are advantages in closer cooperation with Turkey, and my political group sees those advantages, but we're not sure whether those advantages are best achieved through a zombie-like pre-accession process. This process is going nowhere. It's moribund. There is nobody that seriously believes that Turkey will ever be able to join the European Union. Instead, what we need is a positive agenda based on respect for Turkey, and there are many bases for cooperation with Turkey, be it the refugee issue, energy cooperation, cultural exchange, people-to-people contacts, tourism, trade. There are countless fields that we can explore and on the basis of which we can build closer relations with this important neighbour. But when you're talking about proposing the opening of chapters without prejudice to the positions of the member states, we know there's going to be no opening of the chapter because there are those member states that oppose. This means that we're frantically clinging on to a failed process, and we lack the courage to build a new relationship with Turkey. We've been negotiating with Turkey for 11 years, and during those 11 years, the EU-Turkey relationship has not improved. It has deteriorated. It has significantly deteriorated. To some extent, it's poisoned. Look at what the Turkish head of state is doing to a German comedian, Mr. Böhmermann. Artistic freedom, press freedom, this is something that Turkey is seriously struggling with. So let's beat a new path. Let's deal rationally with Turkey and build a respectful and positive agenda, and let's just drop this accession process that's going nowhere anyway. Now for the GUI group, for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Hadjigeorgiou.
Dear colleagues, I'd like to congratulate our rapporteur, Ms. Kati PIRI, for the wonderful cooperation we had during our discussions. But I believe at the same time that the situation in Turkey is much more important than what we're discussing. The report reflects reality to a great extent, but in southeast Turkey there are more or less 300,000 displaced persons. A great part of the city of Sur has been abandoned, and a great part has been confiscated. They took the property, the houses of 60,000. Many university professors and journalists are in prison because they spoke openly. On the 23rd of April, there will be a court case against them. And I've already received an appeal so that MEPs might be present, if they can, as observers. We ask Turkey to start immediately a dialogue to solve the Kurdish issue. We believe that the deletion of the PKK from the list of terrorist organizations of the EU could help. There are many positive references to the Cyprus issue on the report, because they said that the solution should be a development of the Cyprus Republic. But there are many indirect references to opening chapters. We don't agree on that. We accept the positive references of Turkish leaders, but we must say that on the table of negotiations they haven't gone far enough. 10 seconds, please. We want the submission of a map which will help. I believe that Turkey is facing many problems, and they should give an answer to the Turkish people.
Ms. Valero now has a minute and a half for the Greens.
Tack så mycket, fru talman. Jag hade önskat att jag kunde stå här idag och lova.
Thank you very much, President. I had hope that I would be able to speak today and speak words of praise for Turkey and say that they're on the right path. I would have been happy to say that the justice is independent and that there's press freedom. I would have liked to be able to say that Turkey adheres to European values. I would have liked to be able to say that the peace process with the Kurds is going well, but unfortunately I cannot say any of this. Everything is going in the wrong direction, and it's tragic, particularly for Democrats in Turkey, that are fighting for democracy and freedom and human rights. Our resolution is very critical of the developments taking place in Turkey in all aspects, and this resolution calls on both sides to renounce violence and resume peace negotiations. But in order to have negotiations, you need a partner. But one is building palaces while the other is putting people into prison. Since Erdogan hasn't been able to meet with his family, and his correspondence is being blocked, and despite comments from the UN saying that the way he's been treating is similar to torture, and for that reason we call for an end to his imprisonment.
Mr. Carver for the FDD, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. The question over Turkey highlights precisely how far the European Union will go in the name of its neo-colonialist ambitions. For all the posturing over your defence of democracy, human rights and the freedom of press around the world, you've hugely contradicted yourselves with a renewed prospect of Turkey's EU membership at the very moment that concerns regarding the backsliding of these issues have reached their height. And to top it all, you've used taxpayers' money to effectively bribe Turkey into accepting your disastrous asylum policy. That the EU is willing to consider even opening up negotiations for the future accession of Turkey underlines how you're carrying on with business as usual, whilst doing an excellent impression of an ostrich with its head in the sand. Last week, the Dutch effectively rejected EU expansion in their own referendum. And as British public support for Brexit increases, polls in Denmark show that if the UK leaves, a majority of Danish people will want likewise. And all this at the very time of the ongoing crisis over the Eurozone, the Schengen area and migration. Madam President, further enlargement of the EU is a threat to my country. So accordingly, the only way to ensure British security is to vote to leave on the 23rd of June. Thank you.
For 1 minute 30 on behalf of the ENF, Mr. Borghezio. President, this is a masterpiece in hypocrisy. We've seen in the speakers that there are difficulties objectively to Turkey's entry into the European Union. We are seeing praise for Turkey's behaviour, who are hosting a large number of refugees. But we don't... It doesn't talk about how these people are being held, these refugees, or about the mass return of these people. And this is something that's been highlighted by Amnesty International. So this gives rise to a question. Should Turkey be considered a safe country for refugees? And another question, this principle of return of refugees, which is one that the EU has applied to people who are in Italy, Greece, France. But what about Turkey? In Turkey, this is being applied on a mass basis, and this is a substantive problem which undermines this nice agreement with Turkey. I think it's quite clear now that we need to reject this imperialism and ask for checks to be carried out about Turkey's real desire, and also look at the relationship between Turkey and ISIS.
Monsieur Voigt, 1 minute 30.
Mr. Voigt, 1 minute and a half.
Danke, Frau Präsidentin. Ich frage mich.
Thank you, Madam President. I wonder what it is that Turkey has so that it can blackmail the EU in this way. We've drawn up a catalogue of basic rights and none of them apply in Turkey. Christian churches are dishonoured in Turkey. 3 Christians were murdered in Malatya in 2007. It's still not been cleared up, although the 5 murderers are known. Turkey is fighting the Kurds in Syrian territory, thus infringing Syrian sovereignty. European states train Kurdish Peshmergas, and then the same people are killed by the Turkish Air Force. And you say, well, we have to carry on with the accession negotiations. The economic dialogue has to be strengthened. Can such a country be a future partner for the EU, where people are delivering stronger weapons to ISIS? Turkish reporters pick this up and then have to answer for it. How are we supposed to negotiate with people like this? Turkey does not belong to Europe.
Mr. KEFALOGIANNIS.
Thank you, Madam President. We cannot be fully satisfied with such a difficult, complicated report and country. But as chairman of the EU-Turkey delegation at the European Parliament, I would like to congratulate Mrs. Sommer and Mrs. PIRI for working with a sense of responsibility. A lot of the shortcomings in Turkey's situation are mentioned. Sovereign rights must be respected of their neighbouring countries. It must sign up to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's the only country that hasn't ratified it. Must stop violations of the airspace and territorial waters of its neighbouring countries. It must recognise the seminary, the Orthodox seminary in Heybeliada. And the southeastern part of Turkey, there are so many victims of their operations there, and we must ensure that if we don't have the acquis respected, we will not continue opening up negotiating chapters. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bashnaru, 1 minute 30.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Mr. Commissioner, I would start by thanking Kati for such a comprehensive and very well organized report. I will just emphasize some of the most points in my view. I will start by saying that today we shall assess the stalemate of the Turkish accession to the EU, which unfortunately have also contributed to the slowdown in the pace of the reforms and in the respect of the rule of law and fundamental rights in Turkey. I am deeply worried about the serious deterioration of the last 2 years of the freedom of speech, expression and opinion in the country. Therefore, I strongly encourage yet again the Council and the Commission to open chapters 23-24. Simultaneously, I urge Turkey to continue the reform process, to resolve outstanding bilateral issues with its neighbours and to play a constructive role in the Cyprus negotiations. The success of these negotiations is important for the EU and I believe also for Turkey. Second, there is no doubt about the necessity of deepening our cooperation with Turkey in order to solve the current refugee and migration crisis. This being said, I have an important concern about certain aspects of the latest EU-Turkey deal. Finally, but not the least, I would like to express my condolences and my support to all Turkish people and authorities fighting terrorism. And for some of my colleagues, I will remind of wisdom of my people. God gave me the words to hide my intention. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Bostinaru.
Thank you, Mr. Bostinaru. Mr. Belder, for 1 minute.
Dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter.
Thank you, President. The rapporteur, in paragraph 30, rightly refers to the Ezedillah teams. There are a whole series of inquiries underway about human rights here, particularly those that have been violated in the eastern part of the country. Those who know about the facts note that we have to understand exactly what's happening. Erdogan has to take account of the whole situation. He can't not react. There's the situation with the PKK party, and he also has to take account of the situation of migrants in Turkey. Turkey has to start to be a safe country. But this won't happen just with an agreement between the EU and Turkey.
Thank you, President. The vote on this annual report on...
Ďakujem. Myslím, že táto správa znamená niečo nového v vzťahu k Turecku. Naozaj sa poukazuje aj na násilie na juhovýchode krajiny. A obávam sa, že toto správanie sa stáva akoby modelom. A naozaj to vyzerá, že tento parlament je jedinou inštitúciou. My sme jediní politici, ktorí úprimne hovoria o tom, čo sa skutočne deje v Turecku. Sú tam obrovské problémy, ktoré sa len navršujú. A komisia vlastne akoby zamrzla a výročná správa, prepáčte.
Sorry to interrupt you. It seems that there's no English interpretation.
Rečníčku.
I'm speaking English if that helps.
Alors, je me fie à ce qui m'était dit, excusez-moi.
Sorry, I was just repeating what I've been told. Sorry, it's quite right that there shouldn't be interpretation into English.
Donc il n'y a pas de problème. Bon, alors, en tout état de cause, ça a l'air d'être résolu, donc je...
Well, I think it's solved now, so sorry for having interrupted you.
What would you propose, President? I continue or I start over?
Je suis déjà...
I would suggest that you start over from the beginning.
In English, once more. President, everybody, colleagues, Minister, Commissioner. Our vote on the annual report on Turkey comes at a new low point. The text that we're going to adopt is more critical than ever on the rule of law, press freedom, the separation of powers, as well as the violence in the southeast. And frankly, we are seeing a pattern that has become predictable but not less concerning. And it frankly seems like we're the only politicians and the only EU institution that is clearly and vocally speaking out. It is very problematic that the European Commission and the Council have halted their agendas, that the Commission delayed its publication of the annual report, and that there has been a deafening silence when it comes to human rights violations in Turkey recently. We saw Vice President Timmermans rushing to shake hands with President Erdogan 8 days before critical elections, and I would actually like to see him participate in a debate on Turkey in this House. It is key that the Council does not outsource its responsibilities on asylum and considers hope a strategy and hopes that Turkey will solve its problems. The deal on migration has been a toxic one, and I'm afraid we've paid the highest price, the price of our credibility, of our principles and of our words. We are clear in our report of what needs to be done, and I hope the Commission and the Council will change their course. Thank you.
Thank you. Your English is very good, but you still do have to stop at the end of your given time. Mrs. SAKORAFA, for 1 minute.
Thank you. The progress report shows for the first time, with revealing realism, the reality on the ground in Turkey, and Mrs. Piri and those of us who are part of the process have seen this. There are 2 points I'd like to make. We are calling, apparently in this report, on Turkey to help negotiate a comprehensive and viable solution to the Kurdish question. But the EU is still characterizing the PKK as a terrorist organization, but they're part of the solution, and therefore they're legitimizing cleansing operations of Turkey, even within Syria. And they are welcoming the joint agreement on the refugee question and the involvement of NATO in the Aegean. Again, this will only involving NATO is just going to escalate tensions, as will the mention of involvement of the IMF. So I have a question. What type of accession progress can we talk about in a country which is described as it is in the report and which violates international law and agreements it signs up to?
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. We clearly support this necessarily critical report from Mrs. Piri. And we also, of course, support the opening of chapters 23 and 24, because that's where the European Union must make its arguments heard. Turkey is Europe. Europe is incomplete without Turkey. And that is despite the present anti-democratic drift of the Turkish authorities. But the accession process is being negatively contaminated by the refugees question, and certainly Turkey is using this as a token to be exchanged. This is why Parliament wasn't able to debate or therefore reject this report until now. The Turkish practice of returning citizens to Syria who've just escaped from the war has to be condemned. We must get back to the peace process, and the PKK must show that it's prepared to abandon the armed conflict.
Mr. Maragall, will you accept a blue card from Mr. Fontoulis?
Oui.
Yes, Mr. Fontoulis.
Décidément, alors. Monsieur Synadinos, pardon.
Mr. Synadinos, sorry.
I'd like to ask the colleague something, because he's going to make us forget our geography. How can you show that Turkey is a European country? How can you prove that? Thank you.
Yes, comrade. If you care to look back at history and look at the European map of Europe in all directions, you'll see that I'm right. Turkey is Europe. Turkey can and must be Europe. And history gives us plenty of reasons and arguments in favor of that reality, and geography even more, and today's political strategy even more. The role that Turkey is playing in the Syrian conflict is in itself a conclusive reason to regard it as a country and a society. The official country we don't like, but the real country is Europe.
Thank you, Mr. Maragall. Mrs. Winberg, 1 minute.
Tack, fru talman. Rapporten om Turkiet innehåller mycket.
Thank you. The report on Turkey contains lots of information which might call into question their position as a candidate for accession to the European Union, particularly the points on democracy and freedom of association, freedom of press, and so on and so forth. President, we're seeing decidedly authoritarian trends in the country. And of course, this is a huge risk, also in terms of external policy and from a security perspective. This country wants to play an important role in the Syrian conflict. But Turkey also works with groups such as al-Nusra or ISIS. So I think that we have to look at all of this and looking at the agreement with Turkey.
Voorzitter, weer komt dit parlement met een flauwekulrapport over.
Madam President, once again a half-witted report on Turkey, and we could throw it straight away into the waste paper basket. Turkey is sending migrants towards the European Union. It supports Islamic militancy. It infringes human rights. It is committing genocide against the Kurdish people. It suppresses any opposition to its Islamic program. What we have here is the Sultan of Ankara, who wants the world wants us to become Muslims, who wants mosques to become lighthouses in our world, who wants to flood our world. So no free visas, no corrupt money, and Turkey must never become a member of the European Union.
1 minute, Mr. Fontoulis.
Now, the name itself of the report as a progress report is rather unfortunate. It just shows that the EU is trying to serve the interests of Turkey. No progress has been made anywhere in Turkey. It's still a very arrogant country which doesn't respect its neighbours, which is indifferent towards international law. We know that the Turkish government supports the Islamist Caliphate supporters and terrorists, and is also still occupying the northern part of Cyprus. On the migrant question, 150 refugees were sent back to Turkey, and further were on the other side, others were coming into Greece, and Turkey is just turning a blind eye. But the European Union thinks that Turkey is still a very important strategic friend, and continues to sign up to agreements with it, with Sultan Erdogan, and together, which is part of the plan of Chancellor Merkel, which also probably sees her own interests being served by this friendship with Turkey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I support the Turkey Progress Report. Time has come to recognize Turkey's role in receiving 3 million refugees with dignity. At the same time, we should continue to raise our concerns on freedom of expression, independent judiciary, and on the rule of law, as well as the humanitarian situation and the disproportionate military reaction in the southeast. Both sides must lay down weapons and return to the negotiating table. I also welcome the EU action plan with Turkey and the disbursement of €95 million. This should benefit the refugees. Implementation should be done according to international standards and the principle of non-refoulement. Asylum seekers must be evaluated on a human, legally certain and individual basis, and Turkey should be listed as a safe country of return. I welcome also that the accession process finally is back on track. The best way to boost democratic reforms is by opening chapters with a European perspective. It is not a trade-off, Madam Chair, it's win-win. Thank you.
Merci. Thank you. Mr. Howard, 1 minute 30.
Thank you, President. First, this report deliberately does not endorse the EU-Turkey refugee deal. For the EU to be party to arrangements described by the UN Refugee Agency as illegal may be contested, but is deeply worrying. It's right for Europe to seek to cooperate with Turkey and all countries neighbouring Syria in the humanitarian cause of refugees themselves, but clearly only if this encompasses full respect for international humanitarian law. And Europe can never be silenced in criticisms on democracy and human rights in return for cooperation on migration. I saw the siege in Syria in south-east Turkey for myself a month ago. Fight terrorism with our support, but not your own people. Lift the curfews, allow innocent civilians to be evacuated and bodies to be buried, most of all return to a Kurdish peace process. And don't prosecute journalists because they publish stories you don't like, or protest against the British consul attending their court hearing because surely you should have nothing to hide. And don't accuse free academics of being terrorists. Then your Ministry of Justice say those accused of terrorism can have their nationality removed. It's a direct defiance of Article 15 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And to those on the other side who still oppose the opening of EU negotiating chapters with Turkey on justice and human rights, understand how short-sighted are your arguments, and that if Turkey should avoid hypocrisy, so should we.
Thank you. Mr. Bashir, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. I can't imagine anyone who has been in negotiations where they've asked someone for help, yet was surprised when the other party asked for something back. This appears to be what is happening with Turkey, and it seems to have taken many colleagues by surprise. Ideally, I would also prefer to isolate issues from one another. However, we must also be realistic. Turkey plays a crucial role geopolitically in the region, and we need its help to tackle systematic issues which are of enormous concern to everyone, from the immigration package to accession talks in general. This makes some overlap almost inevitable, but it's not necessarily something we should be afraid of. Whilst we must be careful and not to give Turkey a free pass, enhanced cooperation in critical areas from the fight against terrorism to the migrant crisis should be seen as an opportunity to breathe life into our relationship instead of being seen as a step backwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ali, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Regarding the 2015 report on Turkey, we can underline a number of developments concerning the state of play in EU-Turkey relations, cooperation on migration, internal situation and the progress on Cyprus reunification talks. The report welcomes the reinvigoration of the accession process, expresses the hope of opening new negotiation chapters when the benchmarks are met, and supports a structured and a more frequent high-level dialogue on the thematic issues. During the year 2015, Turkey's security situation deteriorated. Concerning the economic criteria, Turkey is well advanced, but the external and internal imbalances should be corrected. In the current geopolitical situation, the 2015 report on Turkey delivers a special attention to the EU-Turkey cooperation on migration. Despite the significant challenges regarding the migration issue, we should proceed faster with the planned activities in the line of mutually beneficial and pragmatic cooperation with Turkey. We welcome the progress made concerning the Cyprus reunification talks that will lead to positive outcomes for both communities on the island. As an overall assessment, despite a number of shortcomings, we can see the clear signals that the accession process is moving forward. Thank you.
Mrs. Reid, 1 minute 30.
Madam President, Turkish accession to the EU is important in its own right, but is especially so now in the light of the UK referendum. Immigration alone makes this a contentious issue, as Turkey, which has been trying to join the EU for many years, is allowing Erdogan to blackmail the EU into accelerating the process. Turkey is not even part of Europe. 97% of it is in Asia. And although, like us, it has a history that shares the glories of Greece, Rome and the Italian Renaissance, it is not part of European culture. Under Ataturk, Turkey became a secular nation, but more recently it has been moving towards Islamism as it was practiced in the 6th century. Does the EU really want Turkey as a member? What will accession mean? We don't even know for certain what the true population is. Figures range from 75 to 79 million. Turkey is also home to millions of refugees who could, in the future, be given a Turkish passport. When Turkey becomes a member of the EU, all these people will have the right to come to Britain. Labour, Lib Dems, Greens and Conservatives all support Turkish entry, and incidentally the Tories are members of the Alliance of European Conservatives and Reformists, a pan-European party in which one of the members is Erdogan's own Justice and Development Party. Turkish membership alone is a big reason for the British to vote to leave on the 23rd of June. Thank you, Madam President.
Mr. Schaffhauser, 1 minute.
Un rapport lucide.
This is a lucid report. It says true things about the dictator Erdogan. It recognizes the Union has closed its eyes on fundamental rights in Turkey for the sake of a cooperation which, let's admit it, is pretty problematic. So one might expect there would be an immediate halt to negotiations on accession. On the contrary, the report suggests that the process should start up again. Colleagues, do you want political Islam in Europe? The propagation of Islamic extremism? Because what you have here is a terrorist regime giving political and logistic support to Daesh. There's a forced partnership imposed by the Americans on NATO. There are smugglers racketing with migrants. And in the face of these truths, you've chosen lies out of weakness and out of cowardice in the face of a master blackmailer who you've already turned into your sultan.
1 minute. Mr. Kovachev, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Whether we like it or not, Turkey is and will be our neighbour. Well, surely we should seek good neighbourly, mutual advantage and relations. A good neighbour respects commitments it has undertaken. It respects human rights, freedom of the media, and does not react with aggression to criticisms. I expect Turkey to respect the agreement with the EU and not to permit the opening of new migration routes. It is in our interest to support the European part of the Turkish society. This European path, however, passes through the recognition of Turkish citizens of Bulgarian origin, for instance, in the regions of Eastern Thrace, in the region of the city of Pehlivanko, known as the Bulgarian name of Pavlovo. Respecting their rights means access to education in Bulgarian, access to the Bulgarian media, and freedom of self-determination. Turkey should try to influence Azerbaijan to find a peaceful solution to the new conflict. Господин Джамбазки. Mr. Джамбазки. Dear colleague, how would you comment Turkey's respect for the agreement, given that last night the Bulgarian border police captured 97 illegal migrants? My second question, how would you comment on Turkey's unacceptable interference in Bulgarian domestic affairs by engineering political processes inside our country? Thank you. Dear colleague, neighbors should always have their intelligence and tools to influence neighboring countries. It is the responsibility of our specialized services to find a way to oppose such attempts coming from Turkey or Russia or elsewhere. As I said concerning the agreement, I said very clearly, I expect Turkey not to allow the opening of a new migrant route via the Balkans.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Mrs. Kati PIRI, the rapporteur, for really being accurate in her description of the situation. Now, this is an opportunity for making our points vis-à-vis Turkey in terms of freedom of expression, democracy, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and so on. This will only have meaning if it is going to be the beginning of an in-depth discussion with the Turkish government and civil society as well, which still has a vision of joining the European Union. But really it is time for us to find a political solution to the Kurdish question with a unilateral ceasefire, and we have to do this before we waive the various other issues that need to be resolved urgently.
Une minute.
Mr. Czarnecki, 1 minute.
Szanowni Państwo, zamknijmy oczy. Ladies and gentlemen, let us close our eyes, imagine the map after accession of Turkey to the EU. Our neighbors would become Iraq, Iran, Syria. Isn't this a fascinating neighborhood? Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that in our discussion we will avoid double standards. If the same politicians who over the years have been claiming that we shouldn't accept Turkey to accede to the EU because they don't respect human rights, and now we have to promptly sign agreement with Turkey concerning refugees in the context of local elections in one of the EU countries. This is hypocrisy. We should talk about Turkey as a future prospect and not under the pressure of current political events.
Attendez.
1 moment, Mr. Czarnecki. Will you accept a blue card?
Oh, Madame President.
But of course, Madam President. Mr. Carver.
Thank you, Mr. Czarnecki. The other issue that nobody speaks about in this chamber, of course, with the possibility of eventual Turkish EU membership, is the shift in the dynamics of the politics of this chamber. Were Turkey to join the European Union with a population of, say, 77 million, if we take the figure of the estimates directly in the middle, they will have the largest number of MEPs, and of course the existing member states will have even less representation. So is that not another reason why Turkey should be kept out of the European Union? Because the main players within the European, and indeed the smaller players within the European Union, will have even less democratic ability to represent their citizens.
Mr. Czarnecki to reply.
I understand that my distinguished speaker has claimed that Europe is not made of rubber, it cannot be expanded without and maintain the same number of the same representation for all the countries, and of course it will lead to a relative reduction of members from existing EU member states, according to the rule that we cannot have more than over 700 deputies.
À suivre, Madame von Storch.
Mrs. von Storch for 2 minutes. We're talking this afternoon about the European Union's new best friend, Turkey. Now, visa freedom is coming along, and then accession. Among Europe's neighbours, there is none that is worse for freedom of assembly, press freedom, women's rights, the rights of Kurds or Christians. Nobody oppresses them as much, tramples them underfoot as much as President Erdogan. And there is nobody to whom we've handed ourselves over, bound hand and foot, as much as to him. Mrs. Merkel is now saying that the safety of the salvation of the Union is in getting nearer to Turkey, and everything must be done to get nearer to Turkey, so that Turkey will do the dirty work for us outside our borders. So freedom of assembly, freedom of opinion, women's rights, Christians' rights, Kurds' rights are all being trampled underfoot as no one else has. A man conducting war in his own country against his own people and in the neighbouring country. He is to be the Union's rescuer. Is that not the final humiliation of the European Union? We've always said in crises we need more EU, but more EU doesn't solve the crises anymore. So now we're saying we need more Turkey, which is ludicrous, isn't it? If you open the Union to Turkey, you're opening up European values as well. The mosques are our barracks, the minarets are our bayonets, cupolas are our helmets, he says. Let's react before it's too late. Negotiations between Turkey and the EU should be broken off, not just suspended. Good relations with Turkey, yes. Accession, no.
Bardzo dziękuję, pani poseł. Thank you very much, madam. It's good that you quote President Erdogan. It's good to see you from this side of the hall. Now, 1 minute, the next speaker.
Merci.
Thank you. Turkey buys oil from the Islamic State refineries. Turkey may have given the same Islamic State the materials needed to create sarin gas. Turkey cracks down on Kurdish rebels rather than jihadists from Islamic State. Turkey lets migrants on its soils to illegally enter Schengen. And so for all of these reasons, it's unacceptable to have visa liberalization for Turkish nationals coming to Europe. Just as it's unacceptable to grant an additional €3 billion to Turkey. And above all, it would be suicidal to continue negotiations on Turkish accession to the European Union.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur député.
Thank you, sir.
Proszę pan. Now, Mr. Jaromír ŠTÉTINA, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, I highly appreciate Turkey as our NATO ally. I appreciate the Turkish initiatives to solve the refugees crisis. And exactly in the name of this cooperation, I must protest against violence committed by Turkey vis-à-vis the Kurds. This is being done in the territory of Turkey. Let's remember destruction of Syria. It keeps bombing the Kurdish camps in Iraq. It has supported the ISIS attack in Kobane in Syria. The spiral of mutual hatred is exacerbated by the PKK party, the terror of which I reject. But very often the Kurdish terror is a reaction to the terror committed by the Turkish forces. I view positively that Turkey has changed its policy towards nationalities recently. Turkey has ceased to call the Kurds Mountain Turks. The Kurds have their representation in the Turkish parliament. The Turkish public is more and more interested in the tragic history of the Turkish nationalism, such as the public commemoration of the Armenian genocide that will be held next week in Istanbul. Thank you for attention.
Dziękuję, pane poslanec. Herr Abgeordneter Josef Weidenholzer, 1 Minute bitte.
Mr. Weidenholzer, for 1 minute. Thank you. Relations with Turkey are among the most important tasks for the present Commission. There are a lot of opportunities and possibilities and dangers and risks as well. There are many things that worry us, like the Kurdish question. This government thinks that it can solve that problem with a free hand. After years of talking about coming closer together, now we have to think about citizens' rights. The report makes all these things very clear. In this situation, Europe should be trying to play a role as a mediator, and the example could be the peace agreement in Northern Ireland, where all parties to the conflict sat around a table, including the ones who in those days were called terrorists.
Vielen Dank. Pani poseł Madam Eleni THEOCHAROUS, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The report and the many colleagues are saying clearly that Turkey cannot become a member of the European Union in spite of its so-called progress, especially on the Cyprus question. And we're just talking about, Commissioner Hahn, we're talking about delusions, and it would be a huge mistake if you entered into procedures and processes which would pander to the Turkish views. A solution at the moment would mean the dissolution of the Republic of Cyprus, because the European Union's values and human rights must be respected. But the European Parliament, instead of standing up for the Republic of Cyprus, is rejecting amendments which would support Cyprus's position. And even the minister didn't mention once the Republic of Cyprus. It didn't use that term. It's not a responsibility of the European Parliament to solve the Cyprus question, but it is its duty to be a guardian of the principles and values of the European Union, to ensure that any solution will respect human rights and the European Union acquis. If it doesn't do this, it will be partly responsible for a failure to find a solution to the Cyprus question, and this is why I call on you to reject this report.
Pan poseł Gerolf Annemans.
Mr. Gerolf Annemans, 1 minute, please.
Waarde collega's, de Duitse vaudeville.
Colleagues, we are talking about all of these aspects relating to Turkey, and we hear about expansion of the Turkish state around the Bosphorus and putting pressure on European Union countries. We've heard people say, je suis Charlie, and we have to ensure that we protect freedom of press. Also, because we're looking at illegal migrants, but often, if we're going to protect our own borders, we have to be more bold. We can't simply give in.
Dank u wel, meneer de voorzitter. Meneer de voorzitter, de rapporteur bevindt zich dit jaar, denk ik.
Thank you, Mr. President. The rapporteur is in a very delicate situation this year. Last year, at the last moment, she managed to cut out a number of clauses talking about early opening of chapters. There's very little reason to open these chapters now. We're talking of limiting freedom of expression, Turkey's role in regional conflicts, lack of rule of law, suppression of minorities, and yet in this year's report, once again, we find a whole lot of references to opening up chapters of negotiations. But Turkey hasn't changed. In the meanwhile, the world around us has changed. It's easy to say, and a lot of people are saying it, that we have to dissociate what's going on from enlargement. But what is it that is happening? The CDA at least is going to vote against opening up chapters. Of course we have to cooperate with Turkey. Of course we do, and I quite am with the rapporteur on that. But, Mr. President, what we're showing here is that we're a long way from what's called the rule of law in Europe.
Now, Madam Eva KAILI, 1 minute, please.
Hello.
Thank you, colleagues, Commissioner. Because of the refugee crisis, we are really doing our best to work together with Turkey, although we have not really seen results from this deal. We haven't given them a blank check, however, and they have to respect the lives of the refugees as well as fundamental rights. Turkey has to respect the media, the independence of the authorities, and of course the rights of the Kurdish population and sovereignty of its neighbouring country, because every day we have violations of our airspace. Cyprus is also a question, and recognition of the genocide of the Pontic peoples and the Armenians is necessary. Finally, they have to respect our ancient churches and not turn them into mosques, but respect them as museums. Trabzon, St. Sophia, for example. And finally, we have to restore trust and confidence amongst ourselves.
Thank you very much. Now it's Mr. Nikolai Barekov. 1 minute, please.
Thank you, President. 150 years ago, Hristo Botev, a national hero and a poet of genius of Bulgaria, called Ottoman Turkey at the time the sick man of Europe. This national hero of Bulgaria died fighting for freedom, shot by the Ottoman Turks. And today, again, Turkey holds the whole of Europe dependent on gas, on immigrants, on refugees. But I would say rather that Turkey depends on us, on our money, on our markets, on our goodwill. It has no other friends. The US, Russia, Iran, Israel are enemies of Turkey and Erdogan, and it is the right time for the European Union to choose the kind of Turkey it wants. And Bulgaria is the only European country that has become liberated from Turkish rule and wells well enough the errors and problems of Turkey throughout its history. And Bulgaria can lead in the future process of negotiations. Thank you.
Monsieur Député Edouard Ferrand.
Mr. Edouard Ferrand, 1 minute. Thank you, President, and thank you, colleagues. If I had to summarise the work of the Commission and the Rapporteur, I would say they need more courage. And you, colleagues, you have to open up your eyes. We've opened up 17 chapters on Turkish accession to the EU. Since 1987, you, the Socialists and the Liberals, the EPP, have implemented the principles of Turkish accession to Europe. And yet have you not seen that there have been attacks on respect for minority and human rights? And also what's happening in Cyprus, this is hypocrisy. And yet, again, we see that we can't criticize Turkey because the European Union is also totalitarian and scorns its people.
Thank you very much.
Now, Mr. Lefteris CHRISTOFOROU, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. I believe that the European Parliament has a duty to speak out clearly on Turkey with this report. Every year, things are worsening. It is worsening its position at all levels. Turkey doesn't respect anybody, nor does it even respect the European Union's principles and values, and it wants to become a member of that union. So it's Turkey that is responsible at the end of the day for its own accession process, but we need to send out a clear message that we cannot allow to pander to people and countries who do not respect our values, because the European Union itself is a union of values and principles. And I think we have to make it clear to those of us who are asking for opening of more chapters to ensure that they implement and comply with conditions. It hasn't even signed the Ankara Protocol, the additional protocol. It doesn't respect or recognize one member of the European Union. 40,000 troops are stationed in a member state of the European Union. Let me ask you, what would you do if you were in the same situation as the people of Cyprus today with regard to the way in which they are treated by Turkey with the violations of these principles? So I will call on the Commission and the colleagues in the Parliament to send out a very clear, strong message to everybody that we are not going to give in to Turkey.
I am a very liberal chairman, but nevertheless, please observe the time limits. I appeal to you.
En primer lugar, quiero reconocer el excelente trabajo que...
First of all, I'd like to recognize the excellent work done by the rapporteur on this complex report. Turkey is a strategic actor in all our challenges facing us in Europe, but that doesn't let us off talking about what the Turks are doing today. President Erdogan is clearly drifting to authoritarianism. The country has a partial civil war on part of its territory. The newspapers are being closed down and journalists put in prison. Liberties are being restricted for many Turks, and Erdogan seems to want a German humorist put in prison. What are we supposed to do now? Open up chapters 24 and 25 so that we can have a close look at fundamental rights and liberties in Turkey? And I'd remind all the European institutions that they have to change course. They can't use the refugees as something to bargain away with Turkey.
Muchas gracias. Anapirotis Notis Marias. Παρακαλώ.
Turkey continues violating the airspace of Greece, and the casus belli against Greece is still in place, and their troops illegally occupy 37% of the Republic of Cyprus. They're working with Daesh, and they're doing business with the jihadist smugglers of oil, and are working in the Middle East. They're responsible, of course, for the refugees that have reached Greece. But Erdogan, the EU is just rewarding Turkey and sending it a dowry with 6 billion euros, entering into political dialogue and waiving visas for Turkish citizens who are going to come in their millions to Greece and the rest of the European Union. Mr. Hahn, you've got to understand that Turkey is not part of the solution. Turkey is part of the problem, as it was in the past, when it carried out a genocide on our Pontic peoples, which nobody has ever mentioned and nobody has raised.
Ευχαριστώ. Anapirotis Demetris Papadakis.
Ευχαριστώ, κύριε Πρόεδρε.
Thank you, President. In this House, we have repeatedly criticized Turkey for violating human rights, for silencing the press and social media, for its stance on the Kurdish question, its relations with ISIS, the blackmailing tactics on refugee crisis, and its occupation of Cyprus. There's a very simple question. Has Turkey shown progress over the years, or is the situation worsening? We know the answer. On a daily basis, we're seeing Turkey moving further and further away from the values of the European Union. I don't think that it is now... Don't you think that it is time that Europe changed its stance and stopped kowtowing to Turkey and started forcing it to become a real democracy? And to stop creating problems, but to be a place that will bring about peace and stability. The College of Commissioners yesterday decided to call the task force for the Turkish Cypriot community a support group for solving the Cyprus question. If you really want to solve the Cyprus question, there's only one way to do it. Take out those occupying Turkish troops, implement the 4 basic freedoms, fundamental freedoms, and implement the community acquis throughout the territory of the European Union, a united European Union. Otherwise, it is doomed to fail.
Now, Mr. Dzambacki, 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Colleague, this year's resolution on Turkey's progress is unacceptable. First, I am outraged that the EP is welcoming the initiative for Turkish to be an official language of the EU. This should not be done. It is a threat to the sovereignty of the European countries. It's a threat to the sovereignty of my country and will have irreversible consequences. Second, we are supporting the unification of Cyprus. Our colleagues from Cyprus is not supporting this. Turkey occupied Cyprus. Should we be interfering grossly in their internal affairs? The European Parliament is silent about the non-respect of the principles of the rule of law and the violation of fundamental rights in exchange for the refugee cooperation. This is hypocrisy. Can't you see that it is Turkey which is organizing the refugees to twist our arms? Fourth, Turkey is interfering in the states of my country and is setting up political parties. The resolution says nothing about Turkey helping foreign terrorist countries with money and equipment. There are many reasons to vote against. The main one, Turkey has no place in the European Union. I will be voting against.
Now, Madam Róża Tomasić, 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much. The report is right to recognize that Turkey is a key partner of the European Union and that this bilateral relationship has a huge potential which can be realized only through an active and credible negotiation process. However, I'm afraid that the rapporteur and I do not have the same understanding of credibility. To negotiate for so long with a country of which not all member states have a positive view is not at all credible. It's certain, therefore, that negotiations with Turkey can last for decades and still not end with Turkish membership in the Union. It's a moot question whether an Islamic democracy can ever become a copy of Western society and whether this is a goal we should aim for. Let's not overlook the fact that Western societies took centuries to mature. I don't believe at all that Turkey, even with the best will in the world, will manage in a short period of time to set up its society according to Western standards. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, now we move on to the Catch the Eye procedure. We have overrun the allotted time, so I will grant the floor only to one representative of each political group, starting with Mr. Cristian Busoli.
Mr President, before being a candidate at the European Union, Turkey is a strategical partner with whom we have to work together on many current issues such as refugees crisis and fight against terrorism. And I welcome the recent agreement between EU and Turkey on the readmission of persons residing without authorization. But at the same time, I want to stress that Turkey's adhesion to the EU is essentially connected to Copenhagen criteria. Therefore, Turkey has to make further progress towards the necessary reforms in order to ensure the respect for the principle of the separation of powers and human rights protection, especially freedom of expression, the rights of minorities and freedom of religion. Having said this, we need to see a real commitment of Turkey in its process of adhesion to the EU, fully respecting EU's values and standards, and also to make sincere efforts in order to find a solution to Cyprus' problem. Thank you very much.
Mulțumesc. Anapliotis Kostas Mavrides.
Thank you, President. There are a lot of truths in the report about what is happening in Turkey today, especially regarding the Kurds. But the question that I would put, not to repeat what has been said already, is what are we doing for Turkey today? Commissioner, let me take you back a few years. In 2005, the Republic of Cyprus helped open chapters for Turkey. And since then, it's been 11 years. So everybody has seen that things in Turkey are much, much worse than they were then, with regard to freedom of the press, violations. As far as Cyprus is concerned, nothing has been done. Akiji, the representative of the Turkish Cypriots, is being told what to do. They're putting fences up in parts in Kyrenia, which is where I come from originally. I'm a refugee from that part of northern Cyprus. They still occupy the northern part of Cyprus. All of this means that they're not interested in dialogue. And finally, Mr. President, removal of the occupying troops of Turkey from Cyprus would mean that they really do want a solution.
Zastupnik Ivan Jakovčić.
Mr. Chair, each country which is on the European continent has the right to become a member of the European Union. Of course, there are conditions for that. There are conditions that each country that wants to join our club has to fulfill. There are no concessions to anyone which includes Turkey. Turkey is our partner, a strategic partner of the European Union in many questions, but there shouldn't be any concessions. We shouldn't forget our fundamental values. All the countries that have become members have respected these values. I believe and I'm convinced that Turkey should be helped when we speak about migrants. Every country that looks after migrants needs our help, but this shouldn't be used as blackmail for accession to the European Union. Turkey should respect the same conditions as everyone else.
Thank you. You're quite right to denounce violations of human rights, the non-respect of the rule of law, and the detention of academics in Turkey. They violate human rights in Turkey and basic fundamental freedoms, even of their own people. So how can we put pressure on them with regard to opening Chapter 24? Some people are just turning a blind eye to what is going on. How can you ask for an opening of chapters when Turkey continues not to recognize the Cyprus Republic? It is unacceptable to make proposals for various types of horse trading in terms of refugees and visas and so on. And the deal, the EU-Turkey deal, is contrary to international law and is not helping the situation with regard to the smuggling of refugees. We need to ensure that we insist that Turkey commits to obliging us and complying with its obligations and criteria. Thank you, Mr. President. Now, if an observer could just follow the debate here in this House, they wouldn't understand anything. They wouldn't know what to think. Turkey violates agreements it signed up to with the European Union, and the European Union is not doing anything about it. They don't recognize the Republic of Cyprus, and they occupy a third of the country. And they're expecting us to go ahead and help it to join the European Union and open chapters. Refugees are coming into Greece and the rest of Europe, and we are rewarding them for not watching the borders with 6 billion euros. You might want to point out that Turkey has made considerable progress in a number of areas. But we've got violations of human rights, international law, silencing of the press, silencing of anyone who expresses views that don't meet the pleasure of Mr. Erdogan. And you reach the conclusion that for all of these problems to be solved, there's only one solution: the immediate accession of Turkey to the European Union.
Karisto. Now, on behalf of the European Commission, Mr. Commissioner Johannes Hahn. Herr Kommissar, bitte sehr.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident, Frau Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President, Minister, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this interesting debate. I think we're all in agreement on one thing this evening, that Turkey is a strategic partner for the European Union. It's a matter of its geostrategic position. It's the question of the number of inhabitants. And obviously the European Union has every interest in having a reasonable form of cooperation with Turkey. But it's clear that this is a relationship that has its ups and its downs. But it must be more comprehensive as a relationship, because the relationship with Turkey has many facets to it. There's an economic relationship, which is an extremely important one, because Europe is by some distance the most important economic and investment partner. We have some 600,000 jobs in Europe in Turkish companies. Turkey is Europe's 6th biggest economic partner, so it's already, for those reasons, important to have a reasonable form of cooperation. Hence, the upgrading of the customs union is an important task for us, and for a year and a half we've been intensively involved in that. And then, with the refugee crisis, this form of cooperation has taken on a new urgency, that's quite clear. And we have a plan now that contains all sorts of different elements. And visa liberalization is one of them. Visa liberalization was already on the agenda, and the question now, as always, is to speed it up. But liberalization doesn't mean that the next step is automatically accession, as is frequently said, because we have visa liberalization with a lot of countries around the world, and yet nobody imagines that all of those countries can be members of the Union. So, yes, we have a mandate from the European Council to conduct accession negotiations. That's been the case since 2005, so we are required to conduct these negotiations and to come to a result, because the mandate says we have to conduct negotiations that are open towards accession. And my professional experience is that negotiations have to be brought to a conclusion before you can assess them. So you have to see the outcome of the negotiations, unless, of course, the negotiations are broken off. But we've heard often this evening how important it is to defend the rule of law in Turkey, and to make sure that the rule of law is present there. But I would say we can only do that when we're conducting the negotiations for accession, because that's the only way we have a lever. There's a qualitative difference between conducting negotiations for accession or sitting down with my neighbor and identifying common points of interest. At the moment, we in the Commission have the task to do those things. I listened with interest to what Count Lambsdorff and others said. It's an interesting idea, but at the moment it is not part of our task. At the moment our task is to implement the agreements to make sure that we get stability in the region, and that, I think, is something we will only achieve if we have very close cooperation in a network with Turkey. And then some of the present refugee crisis can be solved. I can also tell the House that the Turkey facility is already running. It's not true that Turkey, therefore, has not done anything on its side of the agreement. We are financing projects in Turkey whose purpose is to make up for the extra costs that Turkey is incurring through taking in refugees and making sure that the refugees are educated, the children are educated, and making sure that they have the possibility of staying in the region of Western Turkey so that they can then return to their homes in Syria when the political situation allows that. So we are sending the money for those purposes, first of all in Eastern Anatolia, and those activities have started up. And we have spent some 55 million euros making sure that 250,000 people have at least minimal health care, and 50,000 euro makes it possible for 200,000 children to go to school for a year. And those are the most important things which we think we should concentrate on. That's also a contribution to ensuring mutual confidence between Turkey and Europe gets better. It's a difficult task, certainly, but between partners and neighbours, one has to have a trusting relationship. And I think we're both interested in such a thing. And those developments then feed into the negotiations. Thank you.
Herr Kommissar, thank you much indeed. Mr. Commissioner, now on behalf of the European Council, our former colleague, former member of the European Parliament, now Minister of Defence, Madame Jeanine Hennis-Plasschaert. Take the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very happy to be here. Well, let me first of all thank you very much for this very interesting debate and also timely exchange of views, which demonstrates that we, in many respects, share both many hopes and concerns with regard to Turkey. It is important, in my view, to remember that the EU and Turkey share many ties, and that our relation goes back way longer than the current migration crisis. Closer cooperation is good for both Turkey and for the EU, and the EU was and will continue to be an important anchor for Turkey's political and economic reforms. And to be clear, as it was mentioned several times, we are not linking migration and accession talks. These are separate issues. As we have set out, we are aware of existing shortcomings and we share your concerns over negative trends in the areas of rule of law, human rights and fundamental freedoms. We are firm and we are clear about this. Now let me stress once more that we continue to follow these and other developments, such as the situation in the southeast, closely, and that we will continue to bring up our concerns in all our meetings and at all levels with Turkey. Now on the visa liberalisation, Mr. Commissioner did already touch up on it, yet there will be no shortcut, as we have agreed in our common statement with Turkey. Visa requirements for Turkish citizens can be lifted by the end of June this year, provided that all benchmarks have been met. Whether that will materialise, of course, depends on Turkey and the progress it makes. Now, a few words in closing, Mr. Chair, on the 18 March agreement. In my view, the agreement has the potential to constitute a major step in finding a viable and legal European solution to the migration crisis. It's not going to be a silver bullet, it's not going to be a magic solution, but it is a step in the right direction and it's an important instrument. It will be done in accordance with the relevant international standards and in respect of the principle of non-refoulement. It is not easy sailing, we are all aware of this, and we're not outsourcing our problems. It is yet too early to assess the concrete effects of this agreement, as the concrete measures to implement it only became truly operational as of April 4. But let me be clear, it is in all our interest that this is successful. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you
very much. Madam Minister, I have received the following note upon conclusion of this debate. The vote will be tomorrow. Now the next items. The statements of Council and Commission for 2015, the report on Albania. So the first speaker, again, Madam Minister Jeanine Hennis-Plasschaert. The floor is yours.
Let me, honourable members, let me first of all welcome the steady progress Albania has made in addressing the 5 key priorities for the opening of accession negotiations. These are positive signals showing that Albania is on the right path, and we encourage it to continue these efforts. In addition, we do welcome the adoption of the decriminalisation legislation, which should enhance citizens' trust in their political representatives and public institutions. We now look forward to concrete steps and results for its effective implementation. At the same time, I would like to stress that significant challenges lie ahead and further efforts to fulfil the key priorities are still needed. In particular, it will now be essential to swiftly adopt the judicial reform package in line with the Venice Commission's opinion. The judicial reform is key to further forward movement on Albania's EU accession process. Progress is also needed to fight corruption as well as organised crime. A solid track record of proactive investigations, prosecutions and final convictions at all levels needs to be established. Let me also reiterate the need for effective legislative and policy measures to reinforce the protection of human rights and anti-discrimination policies, including the equal treatment of all minorities. As you know, the European Council will consider the opening of accession negotiations once Albania has met the 5 key priorities. And the Council has invited the Commission to report on these key priorities in a comprehensive and detailed manner in addition to its 2016 report. And let me underline, a constructive and sustainable dialogue between the government and the opposition on EU-related reforms will be vital for the success of these endeavours. Now, Mr. Chair, I would like to commend Albania on its full alignment with the EU's common foreign and security policy. And in closing, let me point out that we are closely monitoring the situation in Albania with regards to the migration crisis and to the possible development of an alternative Balkan route across the sea to Italy. Mr. Chair, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Minister. Now, on behalf of the European Commission, Commissioner Johannes Hahn. Take the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, Madam Minister, honourable members. I would like, first of all, to thank the rapporteur, Knut Fleckenstein, for his input and coordination efforts, which resulted in a very balanced text. The resolution not only captures the progress that Albania has made over the past months, but also the challenges that lie ahead in order to move the country closer to the European Union. I particularly welcome the emphasis that this resolution places on the reform of the justice system. This will help to embed the rule of law in the country, strengthening efficiency and professionalism throughout this sector, while striking the right balance between independence and accountability is a key challenge. As the resolution has emphasised, the preparatory work carried out so far on this important dossier is rather solid. Political parties should now engage in a decisive, constructive dialogue and finalise the reform. This is a long overdue development that is in the interest of all citizens. Adopting the judicial reform is a crucial opportunity for the country as a whole, which is too precious to be subject of any party political manoeuvring. I expect constructive cross-party cooperation from both the ruling majority and the opposition, as this reform should be seen by all political actors as a win-win opportunity. The last mile is always the hardest, especially when we are in a final stage of a very comprehensive and thorough reform process. But this is a path worth completing. I made this point very clearly during my recent visit to Tirana for the high-level dialogue on the 5 key priorities for the opening of accession negotiations. This happened by the end of March. Let me also point out that beyond judicial reform, the resolution also provides a clear review